The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with James Redfield. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and today we're going to change your life by talking about a new book by James Redfield called The Celestine Prophecy. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Thank
Good
you.
to have you here. How does a therapist get from being a therapist to a self-published author?
Well, I think it was a decision. First of all, I had been writing for a long time, so it was a natural extension, because much of what the Celestine Prophecy is about how we grow psychologically. There's a spiritual dimension to that, and so the book goes into that as well. But
now, when you say you'd been writing for a long time, do you mean articles?
I think more for my own development, more in a journalistic sort of way. But I've been motivated to write, and the thing that has motivated me has been a need for clarity about how exactly do we live a fuller spiritual life. How do we find that happiness and fulfillment? For the last at least 25 years, we have been asking ourselves, is this all there is? We have this intuition that there's more to life, more in life that we can find. And I think the book was really an answer to that question. How do we, in the last decade of the 20th century, come to grips with the spiritual dimension of life and how to pursue that?
The Celestine Prophecy is a novel, actually.
That's right.
And it deals with the finding of a rare manuscript in Peru that contains 9 insights that sort of chronicle the spiritual development of humankind. Is that sort of fair nutshell
Sure.
description?
It's an old manuscript that contains 9 insights that it predicts the human race will go through, will grasp, as we move from where we are right now, as bad as things are from one perspective, to a totally spiritual and more idealistic culture on the planet. So it is a vision of I guess the theme of the book is that we're visualizing and acquiring a new awareness of how to pursue a more fulfilling spiritual life, and it is sort of slowly moving to change our lives right now in this historical period.
In the book, you describe history as somewhat of a spiral, that we started out as spiritual beings, then along came the age of scientific discovery, and then we started to feel very comfortable with our discoveries that made life easier and less taxing. And now we have come, at least as you write in your book, to another spiritual discovery, but at a higher realm than so it's as if we're spiraling.
I think that's a good way to look at it. I think what's happening is that if we talk about a new spiritual awareness that's emerging on the planet, then what it really is a shift in our worldview. Because 400 years ago, at the beginning of the modern age, we sort of collectively decided that because of all the results that were coming in from science, we collectively decided that we could explore this planet that we found ourselves on and use the resources to make ourselves more comfortable, to develop technology, to develop the means of production, and the means of communicating. And for 400 years, that's what we've been developing. But it became a kind of preoccupation with development and with making ourselves more comfortable as a species on the planet. And in order to assume that preoccupation, we had to sort of push aside the deeper questions of life, and that is, why are we really here? What is the human purpose on this planet? And I think that's the theme of the book, is that that's what we're awakening to now. We're looking at, okay, we've made ourselves comfortable, we've ensured the means of survival, although we've also clouded whether we'll survive ecologically or not. But all that has brought us to a point where we can now ask, well, what are we surviving for on this planet? What is a higher human purpose? And I think the consensus that's emerging is that we are here to unfold and develop spiritually, and we're beginning to pull together common sense for exactly how that takes place, and it's what gives the true purpose and inspiration to our lives at the individual level.
But wouldn't many people say, hey, we're still there. We got some things and we got comfortable, but we got in a pattern where we want more and more things, and we don't need the more and more things really, but we still want them.
Sure. But that's just...
and in the process, we've dumped spiritual concerns.
That's right. But that's the old worldview, that's the old common sense. And I think at the same time, many people still embrace that old common sense. Many other people find it very unfulfilling. And there's a lot of frustration, even desperation out there, because the old purposes for life are not sufficing. People won't stick to the agenda. Nobody follows the old rules of the old worldview. And it's that's the real reason there's so much violence out there, so much desperation, so much frustration that leads people to shoot a whole bunch of people in a subway and then take their own lives. It's just symptomatic, in my view, of the old common sense way of life extending, not really ending, but extending. Filling itself out into a new worldview, one in which we take the best from the old common sense and pull it into a new view of life that has within it a means of gaining more fulfillment and spiritual direction.
I'd like to back up just a little and say that you self-published this book initially.
That's right.
And now it has been picked up by Warner Books with a first printing of 250,000 copies, which is a very large first printing, even for a major publishing house. How does one get from self-publishing to Warner Books?
Well, I think that the only way it happens is when you have a book that becomes a pass-along book, a book that's getting a lot of word of mouth. We thought that would be the case with this book, and we decided to self-publish mainly because we thought the timing was such that it needed to be out there quickly. So what we did was with a very limited printing of 3,000 copies, we just sort of seeded the book in small bookshops. And what happened was that people embraced it and started to pass it along as a sort of a statement of what they also believed about life. And within the first 9 months, we'd sold 100,000 copies that way, strictly word of mouth. So at a certain level, when that's happening, then the bigger publishers take notice. And we found that Warner embraced the spirit of the book, and that truly, I think, believed in its message, and we've been very happy with them. And again, they're shotgunning it everywhere now, which into places where we as self-publishers could not reach. So we're very happy with them.
Do you think that word of mouth has taken place about this book because people are searching for those spiritual answers? I've heard people say that it's more difficult for some people to talk about spiritual matters than it is to talk about sexual matters.
I think what this book did was perhaps put into words what so many people are already experiencing and already feeling. And that's the reason it became such a pass-along book, has become such a pass-along book. So many people were ready to embrace a new angle and approach to life that we could only call spiritual. It's, I think, the result of what has now been at least 25 years of exploration that Western culture has done in terms of how do we conceive of and visualize attaining a higher spiritual life. For 25 years we've been exploring the wisdom of the mystics, in all religions, the people that were really talking about how it feels to have a spiritual connection. And then we have all the information that comes from a couple of decades of gross psychology, and all the how-to books about achieving more out of life. And out of that has come a sort of common sense wisdom that I think we're all coming to at the same time. And it does, in my view, it does not represent an abandonment of the older traditions. It represents an extension of them, where we're moving into a place where we can not just think and explore about spiritual experience, but truly live it and have the experiences that truly make life fulfilling.
You wrote this book as a novel.
All right.
Why did you not simply list 9 insights and tell people how they could be applied to their lives?
Because hearing about it and experiencing it are two different things. And I think that it seemed to me, and the way the book really was best came out on paper, was as a spiritual adventure tale, a parable, in which the reader could sort of tag along in the exploits of a main character and identify with certain experiences, not just hear about them. So there's a sort of an illustration effect, I think, that happens in a novel that's very difficult to make happen in a nonfiction work.
In the novel, Will is sort of the guide for the main character. Metaphorically, do you see Will as being the guide that we all need in the spiritual life?
I think that if in terms of metaphors, this older, wise man would be, and it could be man or a woman in the case of the truth that he presents. Metaphorically, that's our higher self, our higher wisdom. We all have access to more information intuitively that
so you
we
could
trust.
be thinking of an internal guide as well as an external guide.
Well, when you talk metaphorically about it, sure. Mm-hmm. But I think at the same time, we also, in terms of our own spiritual development, we do cross paths with people that can be guides for us. Of course, at the same time, we may be a guide for them from a different point of view. I think one of the themes of the book is that we're trying, is that right now we're pulling into awareness a new interpersonal ethic. Slowing down, observing the chance meetings we have with different people, and seeing those as opportunities to discover new views about the world that actually enhance our own and gives a sense of our own viewpoint expanding and growing and our destiny unfolding.
Publishers Weekly in their review said that, called the book channeled information. Is it?
Well, not in a typical sense. I mean, I think if you talk to authors, they'll all admit that when you're writing a book, when it's coming out in this flow, it all seems to come from beyond you. You're sort of receiving the words in your mind and putting them down.
In the old days, we used to talk about inspired writing.
That's right. That's what it is. And so I don't call it channeled, no, but I call it. It's hard for me to fully take credit for the nuance and the way the plot turns and twists, because it did not feel like I constructed that. It felt like I sort of, that dawned on me in the writing process as I was writing. So.
Well, I think there are a lot of parallels in the insights, and we'll go back later and talk about the insights from the beginning, but
Okay.
I'm just thinking that, for instance, in scriptures, Jesus goes away to pray to sort of renew his energy after many healings, and one of your characters, and many of them, go to look at nature and to meditate on nature and the beauty of nature as a way to renew their energy. So there are those kinds of parallels. I noticed, for instance, in the 8th insight about conversations, that it reminded me of Quaker meetings where
Interesting.
people do not speak unless the Spirit inspires them to do
Yes.
so. They remain quiet
That's
unless
right.
they are really have something to say,
Sure.
we might say, and that sort of reminded me of that insight. You talked in one of the first insights about coincidences, which reminded me of Carl Jung's old book on synchronicity.
That's right.
So that there are lots of sort of themes of that sort in the book that make it fun to read. I think make it fun as well as informative.
I think definitely the book is an attempt to pull together all the loose ends of various paths toward leading a more fulfilling life into something that represents a common sense approach to it. You know, what we're all coming to after having read much of this stuff and integrated it together.
Well, one of the interesting things to me was that that in the novel, part of the plot is that traditional religionists, specifically Roman Catholics, were very much opposed to this whole idea of the manuscript and were suppressing it because it represented kind of an alternative religion. And I sense that you were saying that it was sort of this old line inflexible style of religion against a spirituality that is sort of built for the present age or for the millennium to come, so to speak. Now, I haven't probably put that very well, but maybe you can translate it into...
Well, I think that's right. I think that there's always there are always forces that would rather keep the language just the same.
Status quo.
That's right.
Yes.
And you know, they come from a position of we're guarding tradition, and we don't want all our spiritual truths watered down.
In
Sometimes
effect, though, this wasn't the case. As I saw it for the book, it was sort of an enhancement of many of the tenets of Christianity.
That's right, because there's always that issue. Does something new represent a watering down of tradition, or does it represent an expansion? You know, in a way to understand it more fully. And I think that as the plot plays out in the book, it becomes apparent that the insights represent an extension of what were the basic truths. That in fact that the insights really refer to the way a full spiritual connection with this force we call God feels like, no matter what religion we happen to call ourselves. So it does not undermine any religion, but it adds the experiential part for anyone, no matter what affiliation they have.
Yes, because we know there were mystics in many religious, there were Buddhists.
Every one of them.
and they all had this, it's sort of a common experience for people who are well into their spiritual development.
That's
and
right.
Does not apparently depend upon a particular dogma or doctrine. In fact, some mystics would say that they're freed up from the idea of doctrine or dogma, and that's what leads them into the ecstasy or the really insightfulness.
That's right, because in the end, it's an experience. You know, the connection with this force
And not
we call
necessarily
God.
an intellectual.
That's right. I mean, you can believe the general precepts of most religions and still have the same experience that they all point to at their core.
Now I want to get back and talk a little bit about some of the individual insights, starting with the very first. Well, before we do that, I should say that the insights come to this person one by one, and in other words, he isn't able to absorb insight number 2 until he has experienced fully insight number 1, and on up until the ninth and last in this novel anyway, insight.
Right.
So to get back to the first one, which I found interesting, was coincidence. And when I first read that, I thought, well, I don't see what coincidence has to do with spirituality. Coincidence is what I think of when somebody walks into my office and I say, oh, I was just going to call you.
That's right. If I could tell a quick story, I like to tell this story. There's a story about coincidence or synchronicity. That's what we're talking about. It's really Carl Jung's term, contemporary of Freud in the early part of this century. Defined synchronicity as the perception of meaningful coincidences that seem to be beyond chance. There seems to be a connection that has meaning for us, and also the coincidences that occur that you just could not figure that they could possibly happen from a chance point of view. They were so improbable. Abraham Lincoln, in his early life, the stories told about him when, as we know, he grew up in this rural area. It looked like for all the world he was going to have to be a farmer like everybody else. He wanted to do more. He had an insight and intuition that he wanted to pursue what he knew of the legal life and politics. But he didn't know how that would happen. He didn't know how that could unfold. But one day while walking near his home, he chanced upon a peddler whose cart had broken down. And he deliberated and then decided that he would go and help this peddler. And so they fixed the cart. And in gratitude, the peddler reached back and gave Lincoln an old dusty sack of goods from the cart. And when Lincoln got home with that, he found that within was a full set of law books, from which he went on then to pursue his destiny as we know it. That's a beyond chance kind of occurrence, and these kind of coincidences really happen to everyone. We can all see those. The difference now, I think, in this historical period is that we're beginning to take them seriously, and they represent the way the spiritual operates in our lives. It is constantly tugging at us to actualize a destiny inside, and the coincidences are constantly coming through if we can only just sort of read them correctly to provide the opportunities for our lives to take off in an inspired and destined kind of way.
So do you think insights come to us when we're ready for them, or do they come to us all along and we're just too blind to see them or too preoccupied? Or?
I think both. I think there's a constant stream whether we are aware of them or not. The first insight, of course, in terms of turning on to a new approach to spirituality is when we do start to notice and we start to take them seriously. And again, what they're leading toward is trying to pull us into a direction and to open up opportunities for us to get clear, in my view, of what our true spiritual mission is on the planet. That each of us has this little urge to tell a certain truth, to perform a certain service in life. And that's our destiny. And once we start to pursue that consciously, then that's when the coincidences really start to happen to allow all this to come into reality.
One of the pivotal insights for me was the one on the controlled drama. I found it fascinating. And you lump them into kind of four big varieties of controlled dramas. But I want you to say a little bit more, because what is controlled drama, and why do we need to look at it, and how does it affect this whole idea of becoming insightful in our spiritual life?
Right. Well, I think that what we're trying to do when we talk about a new spiritual consciousness and being able to allow our destinies to unfold and allow these synchronicities to occur is that we have to get out of our own way. And what we do, what is sort of the old common sense way to pursue life, is that we wake up in the morning, we got all this list of things that we want to do, and we think that our goals won't come true, we can't reach our goals unless we have sort of tunnel vision and make sure that we get all these things done. So we just, again, have tunnel vision. We don't represent all the opportunities that can really come into play. I think that, the thing that we have to realize is that we all have a certain style of controlling. And it's, of course, this is spelled out gradually in the book, but what we're really trying to do is build our own inner energy. And if we're not connected with our true spiritual source within, we have to constantly get attention and energy from other people. And so we get into these control dramas. And if you want to just go through them right now.
We have about 2 minutes left. So.
Okay, really quickly then. The control dramas then are bids for attention that we learn in childhood that we're totally unconscious of until we bring them into consciousness. And it's on the spectrum from passive to aggressive. Most passive is the poor me strategy, the victim strategy, in which constantly the victim structures any conversations with anybody around, this is how you let me down. And the people that come into this drama with them are constantly having to go, maybe I'd let them down, maybe I didn't do this, and the victim is always saying, these bad things are happening to me and you're probably not going to help. But what they do is they get our attention that way. And energy flows to them and they feel better. It's an old way of feeling better. Less passive than that is the aloof drama. And that's someone that's just so vague and aloof that people have to constantly dig into figuring out, well, what are you all about? What are you saying to me? Who are you? And the person who's aloof can get lots of attention when people try to figure out who they really are.
And we're going to have to be aloof.
Okay, that's it.
and let people read the Celestine Prophecy to find out about the rest of control drama. Okay. And also, I want to let them know that there may be even a 10th, 11th, or 12th insight coming up for them.
That's right. That's unfolding.
Thank you, James Redfield, for being with us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for watching A Discussion With.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.